But thank you for sticking around. I think you're in for a great session. And, it's a casual session. You can feel free to come up the front if you want to. Don't be shy. I'm going to turn it right over to Brien Flanagan, who's a shareholder with Schwabe. I still want to say Schwabe, Williamson, and Wyatt, but it is Schwabe.
Cut them off.
I know. So Brian's going to moderate this session, and I think you're in for a real treat, some real good insights on infrastructure. So with that, I'll turn it to you, Brien.
Thank you, Greg, and thank you, NABC. We're really excited to be here. We can sit, Mark, but watch out for your mic. We're going to sit here and have a chat about infrastructure and the economy. And just real quick, I'm Brien Flanagan, as was said. I'm with Schwabe Williamson. I'm an energy and environmental regulatory lawyer. And so if I just look at my past week, I was, these guys know, I was down in Phoenix working on some litigation related to a lithium mine. I've been working on a renewable gas facility. I've been working on a renewable diesel facility. I've been out at a plywood mill in northeastern Washington. So an array of things. But when I think about the projects that really resonate with what we're talking about here, I think about something that I had to deal with a little bit this week and in the coming weeks, but it's over time working on a rock quarry in Clatsop County, and then a rock loading facility into barges, and then setting up the offloading points of that in both Fairview and in Portland. And so now we have this waterway infrastructure for moving rock that then can be put into trucks and moved to construction sites in a more environmentally and economically friendly way that helps to sustain and reduce our ability to create infrastructure in the Portland metropolitan area. And I love that I have been able to have touch points at each element of that. So that's been really good, right up until one of those barges crashed into a dock I work on. But that's a story for another time. And today I get a really, really awesome opportunity. Thank you, Greg, for inviting me here to talk with Mark. And some of you know Mark, or you might have seen that he was going to be the speaker here today. Mark was our state economist for 12 years, 14 years, at least in the Office of Economic Analysis. So that is historic. No one has been able to put up with our legislature for that long. And so it's really, really amazing. Particularly, I believe it's called the least enviable position in all of state government. So pretty amazing. Now Mark is at has just recently moved to the Common Sense Institute, and I'm going to take that in opposite order, if I may. If you don't mind, Mark, tell us a little bit about working at your new job. What's it like being at the Common Sense Institute? What are you working on? What are you looking at?
Well, at the Common Sense Institute, there's a main difference with my old job is that policy is on the table. So with my old job, the whole point, our prime directive, we had all sorts of different responsibilities given to us over time, but our prime directive was this quarterly economic and revenue forecast where we set the bar for the legislature on how much they have to spend, and it kicks in our unique kicker law and the like, and that was the main thing. But in order to do that, we weren't like every other state. A lot of other states have 15 forecasts coming out. They're coming out of the executive branch, they're coming out of the legislative branch, they're coming out of the universities, and they get together and they do some kind of bargain to come up with where we set the bar. In Oregon, we do it differently. We have the one number that comes out of the Office of Economic Analysis, and that's it. And so what that means is, our prime value to policymakers is our objectivity. Right. I used to always, it was my go-to joke that they don't care if we're competent as long as we're objective, which was great for us. Over time, of course, that's what got us all our other responsibilities in doing forecasts for clean fuels programs and housing needs and corrections populations and the like, because of this perception of objectivity. But at the same time, that really didn't let us talk about policy. And a lot of the policymakers wanted us to weigh in on policy. And so we'd be in front of the committees and they'd ask us, is this a good idea or is this a bad idea? And we just had to B, these wishy-washy economists give the same old, oh, on one hand, these are the good parts of it. On the other hand, these are the bad parts of it. And even if it's outweighed 20-1, we couldn't do the math, right? We just had to kind of list, okay, here's the good stuff, here's the bad stuff, and move on. And so with the Common Sense Institute, a little bit more free to talk about policy. And although my own, research agenda, I do have some flexibility over it, a lot of it is going to be driven by what is important to Oregonians at the time and what's important to our board of directors. And so going into this legislative session, we've already done work on the Measure 118 tax proposal that's on the ballot. And as we get into the legislative session, we're going to dive into transportation, which I think is going to take the front stage of this session, and look at some other things like farm worker overtime, look at some of the energy policy, and some of the other stuff that might be working through the legislature, and try to give a real facts-based analysis without really being driven by stakeholders.
Well, you're reminding me of a quote that's been put out there, I think in some articles about you in the past, which is Truman's old quote of, I wish I just had an economist with only one hand, as opposed to on this hand versus on this hand. But diving back into your history, and I'll tell you folks, when I talked to Mark in advance of this, really what came out in our discussion is something I want him to start to elucidate over time in this conversation with you, which is the evolution of the Oregon economy, what he's seen and what he's noticing going forward, and how that impacts our infrastructure needs and what is impacted by our current infrastructure. So right now, I kind of want to go back and talk about your job, your insights, and you can be both-handed here or you can be one-handed here because you're no longer the state economist. But tell us what our economy has been. What has been the driver of Oregon's economy or drivers of Oregon's economy?
So the has-been is easy. I'll be more wishy-washy on the what's to come because forecasting, I've learned, is not that easy. But in terms of what has been, it's pretty straightforward in terms of the Oregon economy. And that's because ever since World War II, every time the U.S. economy is growing, Oregon has outperformed other states in terms of job growth and the like. And of course, we make up for it sometimes in our recessions where we outperform as well with these massive job losses and big cuts in our industry. So what is this, boom bust cycle that we've seen for years and years, like I say, since World War II? There are really two things that are driving that. One being that we're still a place that makes things. Obviously, the manufacturing sector is smaller than it used to be. The natural resource sector is smaller than it used to be. But still, relative to other states, we are a place that makes things. And although we've seen those shares of the economy drop drastically from whatever, a third of the economy back in the 70s down to 10% today, that in terms of relative to other states is pretty darn good. That we've really seen, other than like the housing crash or whatever, for very brief periods, in good times and bad, we're still grabbing market share from other states in terms of the manufacturing and the production of goods. It's hard to, and the natural resources, it's just hard to tell because those sectors are shrinking due to global forces. But that said, relative to other states, we're holding our own. And that has always been one reason for the volatility insofar as those sort of industries are the ones that really do well when the rest of the economy, the national economy, of which we're only a tiny 1.2%, is doing well. And then when times are tough, those are really cyclical industries that take a lot of hits. So that's one thing that's really reflected our differences. But the biggest difference has been in our migration trends. So you could say ever since the time of Lewis and Clark, or even maybe the Ice Bridge, whenever we have jobs here in Oregon, people come. And not just anybody, but we're talking about really productive young workers in their route-setting years who are picking their school districts, and they're buying houses and furnishings and autos and setting their routes, which is like the gold standard for economic development. And so we've always had this great advantage in terms of drawing migrants and skilled migrants, in particular the workforce. So we might not have MIT or Stanford here in Oregon, but if one of our firms wants an engineer from one of those places, they've been able to get them at a discount historically relative to other places. And so that has been a tremendous competitive advantage. Now, as we go forward, things might be changing, but I think that's your next question, so I should let you go ahead and tee that up.
No, I want to explore that a little bit more, because I moved to Oregon in 2002, and in about 2006, I used to say to everyone, well, we have the most educated barista class of anywhere I've ever seen. It is amazing. And that really goes to what you say. 2006 might be wrong. It was probably right around 2002. And then in 2006, they started to probably move into professional jobs and fill in as more and more jobs became available. But I think it's interesting to hear that about the migration in and what that does. And I want to explore that a little bit more about both of those factors. So the migration in and just our ability to hold market share. And part of this is coming through to getting away from a lot of baristas, something that you, Greg, and I were talking about, which is the rural and urban divide. And so I'd like you to mix in that idea. So I'm going to make this a compound question. Lawyers aren't really allowed to do that. But mix that into this idea of why do we continue to hold market share in things like manufacturing? Natural resources might be a little bit easier because we have them, but why do you think that we are able to hold that market share, and are we holding it equally in rural and urban areas?
Yeah, so this is going to be a long, meandering answer. If I don't touch everything, I apologize. Just please hit me up for follow up. But in terms of our market share, I think a lot of it has always been livability here. We love this place, and Oregon is a wonderful place to live, always has been. And so again, that's what drives a lot of the migration of the skilled workforce. And when you look at the tiers of what are in terms of business costs, particularly for our most productive industries, it is really getting these skilled workers, right? It's the concept with our chip makers, for example, right? We see these announcements of chip factories due to the federal infrastructure investment across the country with these huge job counts or whatnot. But it's really the quality of workers that we've had here. That what we're getting are the engineers, that are making $300,000 a year, whereas what we don't really compete well in are the folks in the bunny suits, which the bunny suit folks now make less than the median worker in the rest of Oregon, at under $60,000 a year, and unfortunately, with the quality of life we have here and the housing costs, which is another infrastructure I'm sure we'll get to later in terms of the housing supply. It's hard for us to compete on some of that stuff now in terms of cost. Now, cost is still helping us out, always has, in terms of these huge flows of migrants from California and the like, where although we are a high-cost area relative to the median or the average place in America, we aren't relative to some of our Western neighbors, and so we are still, benefiting from that. But that's the big thing is the labor. But then you add on top of the labor, you have traditionally low-cost energy, particularly the electricity from our hydroelectric dams, although that's changing as well in the last couple of years, where we're seeing electricity rates rise rapidly. We have the clean mineral-free water, which a lot of manufacturers need. And we've traditionally also had, land available. Now, as you've heard from earlier speakers over the last couple of days, industrial land certainly remains a challenge, particularly up and down the I-5 corridor where it's most valuable for producers. But nevertheless, we've had some real traditional comparative advantages. Our location has also been an advantage. We're right between these massive markets in British Columbia and California. Asia and the Midwest sends the cars through here, and so we're, in terms of where we are geographically located, has also been a comparative advantage. So we've had some advantages over time. Some of these are starting to appear less so going forward, and that's really the challenge for us now, to determine where we really need to shore up some of our advantages, and really how best to sell the region.
Well, that really short-circuited my notes right there, where you just talked about a lack of industrial land, a lack of housing, reduction in inward migration, higher energy costs, and increased price of living, although still lower than some of our Western neighbors. All of those are stressors on our getting that labor force in here. So that illustrates the problem. Now, where are we going? You've talked about this evolution. Right now, all I've heard is a problem. What's the evolution of the Oregon economy? Is it here? Is it coming? Where does it need to go?
Sure. So all of those are clearly an issue, but again, looking back at our last few decades, obviously migration trends have been our primary comparative advantage. And so that's where we have to start when we do this discussion. And I'm not ready to say that, the good times are over, that the bloom's off the rose, or any of that stuff, right? So the last time we saw outflows of migration in Oregon was in the early 80s, when all the timber mills closed across the state. And at that point in time, people didn't have jobs, so they left their rural communities, they moved elsewhere. Now, since then, the 40, 50 years since then, things haven't been so bad. And that's the one thing that encourages me more than anything else, right? So you look at a place like Lincoln City, lost as many jobs as Youngstown, Ohio did when the autos left. And Coos Bay is as bad as Flint, Michigan. But those places, their populations were cut in more than half, and no one ever came back. Meanwhile, Lincoln City and Coos Bay were able to, add 1% or 2% every now and then, and stayed about the same. And so that's really, that's very, very much encouraging. And so and this time it's completely different. So last time we had the population losses, we had this massive shock to our fundamental industry in the state. People didn't have jobs, they left. This time, people were leaving even though almost anyone who wanted to have a job could get one, which is fundamentally different, and a lot of things point toward affordability at the time. The fact that a lot of households with children were moving out suggests that they needed something a little bit more affordable and the like, and the places that people were flowing to tended to be low-cost areas in Texas or Idaho or places like that, where we still never really saw a decline in in-migration, where the in-migration, and it's still to this date, is still holding up very strong, from places like California and the like. We're still getting a lot of people moving in. We just had a lot of folks moving out, and it did seem like affordability was a big part of it.
And that's currently what we're seeing, correct?
Yeah, currently we just a couple of weeks ago got the 2023 mid-year population census estimates, which are still flat, barely down year over year on the statewide total, but the outflows have come down drastically. So the outflows out of Oregon have come down drastically, and we're still above water. And again, that root setting years, those young workers, we're still netting positive there. And so it looks like we're moving in the right direction. Now, if we're not, then maybe we are in a new world. So what might that look like? Well, there are really a couple different ways that you can go. And one way is in a low investment, a low capital type of economy, where we've seen, I already mentioned the Rust Belt, but we saw it in the Farm Belt and in the textile towns in the Deep South, where we had these industrial shocks that the areas never really recovered from. But then there are other areas where we don't have this population-driven job growth like Oregon has become accustomed to, where we're drawing in all these workers and then have above average jobs, but still do better economically than the average due to more income gains and productivity gains and investment gains. So more of a California or a Massachusetts sort of equilibrium. And so that's where infrastructure really, plays a huge role. To what extent, if we're not going to get more workers, to what extent can we make the workers that we have more productive and create more economic opportunities for everyone?
So getting onto that infrastructure side of it, because it turns out we're at an infrastructure conference. Yeah. The thing we didn't explore is in the old economy, what might still be around, this influx of people, influx of workers. What's the infrastructure that's most needed or valuable there? And then if it was to evolve to this more stagnant state of play, what would the infrastructure needs be in that case? What are you solving for?
Yeah, I think, again, for businesses of all size, the main cost that they have is in their labor force. I mean, not every industry, but the vast majority of them. And so what that means is we really need to build infrastructure in order to continue to have our comparative advantage in quality of life. And so we're talking about housing costs and housing supply. We're talking about utility infrastructure, so we have lower energy costs for households and the like. And transportation infrastructure, so there's less congestion and the like. And so the idea is to continue to keep the bloom on Oregon's rose. It's a wonderful place to live. And as long as we have that, I think that's really the core going forward. Even if we're not being driven by the population gains, that certainly allows businesses to get their biggest cost off their back. But then there are other costs, of course. There's the tax burden and the business's direct costs for energy and the costs for land and whatnot, and regulation and all that stuff that they also value. But I think the key really is just making it a good place to live, increasing the supply of labor, even though it might not be growing as fast as it used to, but just doing enough in order to support the growing businesses we have here in the state.
So what I'm hearing is really from an infrastructure standpoint, I'm not sure we have that much of a differentiation. You and I have talked about congestion costs in the past. Just Mark has regaled me with the incredible costs of getting people stuck in traffic and how that increases the cost, reduces productivity. Housing, obviously, you need more supply to reduce those costs. And all of these type of things, you've talked about energy, but how do we as a society, as Oregonians, and I'd love to hear it from both the state level, the municipal level, how do we direct funding? How do we work to improve these things? How do we unbottleneck the energy economy, the transportation economy, the housing economy?
Well, it starts with more money is better. So in terms of state and local investment into infrastructure, in 1970 we were looking at 25% of the budget. Now we're looking at about 15% of the budget.
Say that again, Mark.
So in terms of state and local spending, the share that goes onto infrastructure projects used to be a quarter of the budget in 1970, and now we're down to under 15%. And so that's that's a constraint, and we're seeing a lot of our infrastructure age. We're lucky enough to be young enough that we don't have a lot of lead in our water or things like that, but it's not going to last forever. And so we really do need to make some of these longer term investments that we haven't in the past or in recent years. And so that's something that's going to be very important, right? Because again, if the extent to which we invest in the productivity of our workers, that's going to give us our growth advantages going forward. So what do we do, right? So what would you say? I know there's not limitless dollars out there for the public, so a lot of it has to do with we really do need some centralized decision making for both the big and the little. So for the big things, right, we need to kind of come up with a grand strategy, right, rather than piecemeal. First thing we have to figure out that we don't do very well in Oregon to date is in the transportation side, the capacity argument. So right now we're kind of, not only does the Department of Transportation have these long-term funding challenges and constitutional constraints in terms of equity that they're fighting through now and being sued by the truck drivers and the like, but the bottom line, we need to have some kind of strategy, and right now we're into these two camps where we have these true believers into no new capacity or new capacity. And it's one size doesn't necessarily fit all. There are places where you need new capacity, right? Rural areas, for example, I would encourage all of you to Google Bruce Weber from the Oregon State University, who spent a lifetime in his career talking about rural Oregon and what it needs to grow. And it's all about this connectivity, which it used to be the transportation network, now it's also the broadband, which we're starting to see or whatnot, but he made some pretty compelling arguments that there is a certain causality between connectedness to the population centers of our rural areas and how well they do economically. So some of these rural areas need more capacity, right? And if you just look at a highway map on the East Coast, now I know they don't have a coast range that blocks them off, but on the East Coast there are these, all these arteries that get you out to the beautiful places on the eastern shore of Maryland or the Outer Banks in North Carolina or places like that. Here in Oregon, you can't get out to the coast without being on a two-way, one way each way at some point, even on our biggest roads. So what do we do then? There are a lot of communities out there saying, oh, well, we need these huge infrastructure investments. We need this dredging and we need a deep water port. But who are you going to give it to? We're not Oprah. We can't say, okay, Astoria, you get a port, and Lincoln City, you get a port, and Coos Bay, you get a port. And not only do you need a port, but then you need the transportation network to get there. Otherwise, that port's going to be useless. I mean, right now, the shipping industry is quite comfortable saying, okay, we'll do Long Beach and Tacoma, put them on a truck, and send them thousands of miles. That's cheaper than changing modes of traffic, of transportation or whatnot over time. And so you obviously need some kind of centralized strategy here. And there are going to be winners and losers, but you have to kind of put your eggs into one basket, so to speak, in a way. And so a lot of that's going to take some centralized decision making. And again, where is capacity good? Where is it bad? Let's just not do a black and white story in terms of that. And then, the energy I didn't even get into, but. Oh, sorry.
Keep going. Come on, I got you wound up.
Yeah, I'm all wound up. No, we have all these. I'm frankly confused by all the different climate executive orders and administrative rules and vague statutes that have been put out over the last several years. I'm not sure how they all work together, and so a little bit of consolidation there would be nice. But one thing that is pretty clear is in terms of our electricity policies for the utilities, that a lot of it in terms of the plans that the providers have put out really depend on investments in a whole lot of new storage technology, a lot of new transmission technology, things like that. And I really haven't heard that discussion at the higher level of the state in terms of when or if those investments are going to come.
Well, I'll jump in there and give kind of my 2 cents, since no one asked for them, but I've got the mic. And I'm always, because you said this consolidated strategy to me, and I kind of, well, we were on the phone, so he might not have known that I was scoffing, because I go back to a great Daily Show where Jon Stewart said, we need a centralized energy policy in this country. And then he shows one of his brilliant clips, and it goes all the way back to like Lyndon Johnson or Eisenhower saying consolidated energy policy. And never in, decade upon decade, presidential term upon presidential term do we get there. But, I'm going to switch to one thing where I think we kind of have gotten one on the federal level. But on the transmission side, you hit me with that on the end. And I've been in we do a lot of transmission work. If you go talk to the folks at PG, Pacificorp, PG&E, SRP, APS, any of the Western utilities, they're going to tell you we need 1 million miles of new transmission to change to change our energy economy, to get wind and solar and all these things hooked up and to be efficient, and get rid of some of these old lines. And I don't even think that had to do with wildfires and anything. We were just talking about connectivity. And we can't, their belief is we always end up getting there. It just takes a lot longer and costs a lot more. And so I like that they have that mentality, but we've done nothing to help them. And transmission's super hard. How can I build a wind plant in Wyoming to service PGE customers in Oregon? Well, that's got to go across Wyoming, across Utah, across Idaho. My states aren't good here. Don't get me on geography. And into Oregon. Well, that's through multiple jurisdictions, none of whom are getting that power. Why the hell are they going to agree to that? And that has federal approvals. It has state PUC approvals, probably local approvals, land use authority, easements, all of those things need to occur. So it's a total patchwork and totally goes to what you say. If we really want to change this over and want to do it in any kind of rush, we need to stop this. We need to have a consolidated plan to do this and say we're going to do it. We don't seem to have that political will. We don't seem to have that will as a populace. So it's really, really hard to think that we are going to say, we're going to pick winners and losers. I saw when the WRDA bill, Water Resources Development Act, which is re-upped every year, Sean Clark over there knows it well, they gave all this money to large ports. They picked a winner, but not the small ports. So there they are, the fishing ports in Oregon, freaking out because they can't get their marinas dredged, so they can't get their fishing boats out. And the state ended up stepping in, ended up getting some federal money, and they kind of had to backtrack because the consolidated approach has so many political consequences. I'm not saying this to take a side. I'm just saying it's really, I mean, you acknowledge this too. It's just really, really hard. The one place where I've seen it all of a sudden have an amazing impact was the Inflation Reduction Act, which we all know has nothing to do with inflation, right? But it does have everything to do with changing the energy economy. And controversial, right? Passed through by by essentially a supermajority, but not a real supermajority. But it has taken hold. And this is what I thought was really, really interesting, and I thought a recipe for success. It has taken hold of the economy and the financial system and the business system. The utilities are on board with it. There's a cross-section, a swath of the United States that is very, very invested in the incentives, the grants, the tax credits that are made up of in the Inflation Reduction Act. And I think it's a really good model to look at. I had a conversation with some folks, I won't be too specific, but some folks in Ohio, who were talking about when J.D. Vance got nominated, or excuse me, got put in as the VP nominee, and how they were running to him because he had been speaking out against the IRA and saying, no, you got to save this. You cannot do this, man. You've got to keep this thing in place. And that showed to me the bipartisan need for the IRA and how people really across the aisle are understanding the power of that. By the way, anyone here can be totally disagree with me, and that's fine. I just think well, it's fine, but I disagree with you too, because I think that became a model of using these different grants and credits, really kind of giving a carrot to people to get out there and make this change. And it was really, really interesting. I don't know, that's my little soapbox diatribe on a number of things, but ultimately on the IRA, I don't know if you have thoughts about how you put these things together and get that kind of consensus and policy building.
No, absolutely, it's difficult, and all politics are local, and we know some of our locals here in Oregon are a little kooky, so it's tough to really sometimes get the most efficient things through. But that said, I think it's pretty obvious that we have kind of a dearth in investment, and that there is some low-hanging fruit out there that we can get return on investment for. Now, it's very difficult. I don't know if I have solutions, particularly at the state level, because we budget on a 2-year process. And unfortunately, these infrastructure investments are all sorts of other investments. It takes a while if you're investing in, pre-K education or for whatever else. It's going to take a while before that bears fruit, and so it doesn't show up in the current budget system. In which case we have to have a balanced budget, and so some of this low-hanging fruit ends up rotting on the vine because we don't go after it. And so that's always going to be the trick with infrastructure, and the timing is everything. And even with the Inflation Reduction Act, the shovels in the ground are coming a lot later than we predicted when it was first passed, in terms of a lot of the stuff, the rollout of this stuff. And if you look at these economic studies, we're looking at, okay, what's your return on investment for infrastructure projects, which still to this date are more than 50% transportation, the traditional stuff. And it's always positive, but it pushed out a few years, and sometimes in the early years, it's actually a drag on economic performance. Now, we don't have to worry at the state level about crowding.
Why would that be? Why would it be a drag at first?
Well, a couple issues, in terms of the borrowing costs, and or if you increase taxes, they say that's even less effective. Which is surprising to me, that if it's deficit spending or borrowing for infrastructure projects, they say it's actually less harmful in the near term than if you actually tax and draw down contemporaneous private economic activity by funding these things. But it takes forever to get started, and it takes forever to actually get this stuff up and running. But then when you're 5 or 10 years down the road, then you start to see the benefits of the infrastructure spending. And
so my getting trapped in 217 construction every day there's gonna be a benefit at the end of this?
Eventually, but then they're gonna start the next one. They're gonna have a new highway bill this legislature, so they'll tear everything up. This summer was tough to get around, that's for sure. So that's an issue. It's this time consistency of these investments, and when we're actually going to see them, and it makes it very hard for policymakers who are living in the now.
Now, one thing we talked about was this whole issue of I'm not sure if I want to take it this direction yet, but we talked about increasing funds to the state government. Actually, I'm going to stop real quick. I want to focus where we were. What is the infrastructure project
that you've seen that has had the best bang for its buck?
Oh, that's a very good question. Probably haven't seen a whole lot since the hydroelectric dams probably were big. Highway 205 was pretty big, but we haven't had a whole lot of big ones since then. And the problem going forward is a lot of them in terms of bang for the buck aren't going to pencil out like we're used to, right? In terms of saying, okay, there's some, economists put together their papers on the return on investment, and so a highway project is somewhere between, for every $100 you get $150 or maybe $113 or whatever back. That's, the studies they range exactly where they are, but some of the stuff right now that's facing Oregon isn't as easy to cost out. So what is the value for spending the hundreds of millions of dollars it'll take to improve the levee in North Portland on the Columbia Slough? We know that levee is not up to standard. At some point, things are going to flood, and we have other things like obviously the seismic upgrades across the state, the upgrades to the electrical transmission lines and stuff, not just for wildfires, but also for efficiency. And this stuff is harder to price and say, oh, okay, we're going to get all this extra. If we rebuild the levee tomorrow, are we going to get a ton of extra economic activity? Probably not, but the downside of not doing it could be catastrophic. And so I think these are the things that right now are the most pressing issues for us aren't so much, we're going to build a high-speed rail to get down to California, which would be cool and would increase economic activity. But I think, if we were to prioritize, some of it's more of limiting the downside than it is increasing growth.
When we talked, you surprised me with something. Once you said it, it wasn't that surprising. But you talked about, I think I asked you, it's a separate question. It's where is the best place for government to invest its money? I think that was the question. And it led you to say, do you remember your answer?
I went small businesses versus big businesses because we were coming off a conversation about industrial lands and economic development incentives and the like, right? And where I went with it was that, trying to take down these big fish and bring in some big production facility from a big corporation housed in another state isn't the best for economic development. I mean, it's good. Every job's a good job. But the way we really, have grown and everywhere has grown is really homegrown. It's really making it a fertile business environment for, building the infrastructure so that businesses can have their workers and who can afford to live here and can afford their utilities and their rents and whatnot, and say, okay, well, let's build from the ground up. So we have we do have a massive chip maker here in Oregon, and who brings in a ton of engineers and great jobs, but we don't have any of their legal services. We don't have any of their accounting services. Those are all down in California. Meanwhile, if you have a fella selling shoes out of a van in Eugene, and next thing you know, we have a world-class advertising firm in Portland. And all the stuff that grows around it. I know it's been 25 years now since we lost Willamette Industries, who were bought by our neighbor to the north. But at that point in time, there was a major law firm in Portland where every partner lost 50% of their income overnight when that was sold. And so it's really these, can we cultivate our homegrown industries? And to what extent can we make that easier on them? Can we make it less costly for their workers, less costly for them in terms of their other business costs? and tax burdens and the like.
And protect their lawyers.
And the lawyers. And we want to make sure that every partner gets their fair share.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So that's like a nightmare. And so that's important. To me, what's so interesting about this conversation, Mark, and you and I have had a few, and it's been a consistent theme, is this whole idea of how critical those smart baristas are. Having those educated baristas, bringing in those continually good jobs, good workers, and being able to foster that, and how critical that's been for our economy. And I appreciate this about the homegrown business market and the idea of startups in this state, because I think that's something to think about. But what was tied into that we've got to take as part of this infrastructure is that the reason they want to start their business here, reason they want to grow their business here is because they can commute relatively easily. They can buy a house affordably. They have good schools. The energy prices aren't out of control. And so they can build and feel comfortable building, and the support services can build around them. I just think that's critical. And the big thing you've said, and we've only touched on it, I feel like, very briefly, is that the evolution of our economy, if this growth really has stagnated in terms of the in-migration, really comes down to more of a value proposition. How do we keep those value markers going? Now, I sort of poo-poo this idea of we need to find political consensus and agree we're going to go this way and that way, and in some ways pick winners and losers. And hopefully I'm wrong. Hopefully we get some real drive to do things, and hopefully we get rid of some of these barriers to getting these projects up and running. But one thing you said that I've seen the value of, said to me outside of this conversation, which is another place we see government really come in. And Mark and I were having this discussion about the kicker and about budgeting and all the issues with budgeting, and that concern about growing. Government grows and grows and grows, and then you hit a recession, and now they don't have the money to pay for all of those programs. So then all of a sudden, government's cutting all over the place at the same time that the populace needs services. And one of the things you talked about was in really picking, instead of growing a program, picking places to put your money. Talk a little bit about that and explain it a little better than I did.
No, I think you did a great job explaining it. That, Oregon across states has an extremely volatile revenue system, along with its underlying volatile economy, but even more so, where it's really a boom and bust system, where on the average year, we are going to see more revenue growth than the vast majority of all states, but there's no such thing as an average year. And so what we do see is we see these big swings one way or the other. And so what happens is when we get these windfall gains, and even though we paid out one of these days I'll get to stop talking about the kicker, my favorite topic, but even though we paid out a record kicker this last biennium, it also came with a lot of unanticipated revenue for policymakers and budget writers. So over these last 3 biennia, we've been giving out kickers, which show up as credits when you go pay your taxes in April. Either you get a bigger refund or a smaller payment. But that said, policymakers and budget writers keep getting positive surprises as well. So even with the kicker, they're ending up seeing a lot more revenue than they expected, right? The kicker's based primarily on the personal income tax. We have all sorts of other tax streams now, a lot of consumption-oriented taxes that we never had before. We'll never be a sales tax state, but we have the corporate activity tax, we have marijuana taxes, we have liquor taxes, we have lodging taxes, we have vehicle privilege taxes, the privilege of buying a vehicle. You have to pay a tax to buy a bicycle now. You have to, so they added all these sort of things on top, billions and billions, and they've seen this tremendous amount of growth. And the thing is, when one of the tax instruments booms, they pretty much all boom. And so legislators have been in this world where, yes, they've had to, there has been a kicker coming out in April, and they got less money than they would have otherwise. They're still getting more money than they expected when they crafted the budgets. And so they've been in this situation that can't last forever in terms of these windfall gains. And a lot of that's come from a tremendous amount of taxpayer behavioral shifts. Now, in terms of the Great Recession, that was a big surprise. We saw, thousands and thousands of job losses. And thought, okay, well, we'll have to take a couple $1 billion out of the budget as a result. But then instead of a couple $1 billion out, it grew faster than we would have ever expected. And some of that came from federal stimulus and whatnot. Some of it came from the fact that it was a very unique cycle where we had all these job losses, but in terms of non-wage forms of income, in terms of what's going on in the stock market and the housing market and business income that passes through for both, your S corps, your C corps, and your corporate, the profits, all of those things boomed during the pandemic, which created this huge wave of income growth. And then there was also movement across time. And when you have all these non-wage forms of income, like business income and like stock market income and the whatnot, those aren't realized for tax purposes at the same time they're earned in the market. You could sit on a stock for 10 years, and then you go ahead and cash it in at one point, and that's when you pay your taxes. Well, so we had this perfect storm, not only of a run-up in all these non-wage forms of income, but we also had a belief across the economy, particularly with accountants and tax professionals, that we were going to get shifts in the federal tax code, which in the past have created this, in 2021 we saw double the liability growth we'd ever seen in any other year. The other years that were half of that were always when the federal government changed the capital gains code or something like that, in 1985 and the Reagan cuts, or when the Bush tax cuts expired. We had, taxpayer behavior. People are trying to either pull their income forward to get ahead of a tax increase or push their income out and their costs forward to get ahead of a tax cut that's going to happen. And so the prevailing wisdom at that point in time in 2020, 2021 was that we had a new presidential administration, control of both branches of Congress, and there were going to be some of these tax cuts from the previous administration were going to get rolled back. And so what did tax professionals do? They said, we better realize as much income as we can today and push off as much cost as we can until tomorrow to try to exploit this, change in policy that never actually came to pass. So we get these big windfalls, and so I'm finally getting around to your actual question, I'm sorry. So once you get these big windfalls, the key is not to stand up permanent programs. They're going to take a life of their own and are going to require funding going down the line. It would be one-time things, infrastructure being, paramount among them, right? You make these one-time investments, you have a one-time windfall money, and then this gives you the flexibility to do that in this stupid little 2-year budget window we have. We don't have to, necessarily balance the 2-year costs with the 2-year benefits. We can make these longer-term investments and have them bear fruit over the years. Now, our policymakers have paid a lot of lip service to this. When I used to go in front of the ratings agencies, when we would borrow money, that was always a big story, that we're not doing long-term stuff. We're just doing one-time investments. It's easier said than done when you run some of these pilot programs and they're popular. it's harder to kill them than you'd think, even though they're only actually, on paper for a couple of years. They take on a life of their own, so it is kind of hard to kill them sometimes, even though they are, in theory, just a one-time investment.
So I think we're at time, but I would like to look around and just see if we could probably take a question or two as long as we keep it brief. Go for it.
We've talked about critical infrastructure shortfalls, and you talked about your favorite subject, the kicker. What would it take in an ideal world to get the kicker to become the critical infrastructure kicker and take the windfall and invest it?
Did folks hear that? So, yeah, what would it take to get the kicker to be used as a critical infrastructure windfall fund? Something along those lines.
Yeah, thanks for repeating the question, or otherwise I wouldn't. It's not impossible. 1995, they did it. They swept the kicker. But it takes, it's in the Constitution, it takes a 2/3 vote. So a supermajority vote of the legislature, and they officially changed the revenue estimate from 2 years ago to whatever they want it to be. So they could chop that kicker in half, take it all, take a quarter of it, whatnot. But a 2/3 vote is a heavy lift.
Mr. Clark.
Short of that, what's the way? I mean, if we can't get, Thank you. Yeah, my bad. If we can't get something like that creative, how do we? I mean, obviously, legislatively getting people on board, but how do we get money dedicated to this infrastructure that is always getting older?
Yeah, so again, the kicker's a tricky one, given that it's in the Constitution, and that's a 2/3 thing, and it's pretty much stuck in stone. But that said, I mentioned before, we have all of these consumption-based taxes now that have been expanding over time. And what happens when they pass one of these new taxes, a vehicle privilege tax or a commercial activity tax or something like that? Well, you notice they don't put them in the general fund anymore because the general fund is subject to that kicker calculation. So now we do have a lot of different revenue sources that we didn't used to have for Oregon that could potentially, they're all sourced toward, directly towards programs rather than the general fund. And we've seen some of those shift around in recent years, particularly the marijuana revenue and the like. And so I think that would be your best avenue, would be to look at some of these new tax instruments, these new consumption-based tax instruments, and try to dedicate that toward a more permanent infrastructure solution. Now, that said, have to tip my hat to the legislature over the last 3 sessions for really devoting a lot into the housing pot. But that's, that would take every session. You have to do that over and over again to continue that kind of funding.
Well, folks, if I can wrap up, and what I think we really heard today was that there's a shift going on in Oregon's economy from this growth model to really a model of value. And value is going to require some significant capital expenditures. And I hear that reflected in the questions that you guys are picking up on that. It's not really a surprise. I think you heard a lot today about our aging infrastructure. And I'll tell you, I came here today having had these conversations with Mark before we got here, thinking, okay, we got to hear about how we're going to build new infrastructure, make things faster, better. And I got here in this seat now after hearing some of the talks today and thinking, oh geez, we got to shore up some of this stuff. And you talked about the levy, and that's a critical one. If we don't shore that up, well, what happens then? That might not add value, but what it does, it keeps us from losing value. Same with a lot of our bridges. Same with the seismic retrogrades. So to me, what I'm hearing on a value platform is that we need to really do both of these things. And we need to find sources of funds. And us as people who are engaged in both this infrastructure and policy aspect really need to be thinking about this and advocating for it just in the way we have our conversations. That's my take on it. And but thank you all for sticking around to the very end here. I want to thank Mark for this very engaging discussion, very educated discussion. And thank you to NEBC. But let's give a round for Mark, and thank you all.
Yeah, I can't really wrap it up any better than that, Brien. Mark, thank you. Very, very good information. But walking away with more questions and thoughts around the topic of infrastructure, I appreciate that. Keep this conversation alive. With that, thank you for attending, and we'll look forward to announcing the 2025 infrastructure date and location very soon. Thank you.